The sound of rain drummed steadily against the bus windows, the rhythm almost hypnotic as the drops merged and raced down the glass. I leaned my head against the window, my eyes half closed, trying to focus on the landscape outside. But there wasn't much to see, just endless stretches of dark, empty road and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the trees in the distance. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere. I should have been home by now. The trip that usually took just over an hour had stretched on for nearly 2, and the storm wasn't letting up. The bus moved slowly, its wheels splashing through puddles as it navigated the slick road. There were only a few of us on board at this late hour, a couple sitting near the front, a man in a suit who looked like he had been asleep for most of the ride, and a woman with gray hair silently watching the rain in the back. Everyone seemed wrapped up in their own world, including me. The driver, though, something about him felt off. I hadn't really paid much attention to him when I boarded, but now, every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt like his eyes lingered a little too long. I could only see part of his face from where I was sitting, but there was something cold about it, something that made me feel uneasy. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the strange feeling crawling up my spine. It was just the storm, I told myself. The darkness. The isolation. I was tired from visiting my mom, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and sleep this feeling away. But the more I tried to relax, the more I felt it, that creeping sense of discomfort. Like something wasn't right, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I must have dozed off for a moment because the sudden jolt of the bus stopping snapped me awake. My body lurched forward, and I grabbed the seat in front of me to steady myself. Blinking, I looked around, trying to figure out why we had stopped. We were in the middle of a dark, empty road. No streetlights, no buildings, just darkness all around, broken only by the sheets of rain hammering against the windows. The driver mumbled something under his breath and peered out through the windshield. I couldn't see anything out there, but then, as the lightning flashed, I noticed it. A figure stood in the road, barely visible in the downpour. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no, the figure didn't move, didn't flinch as the rain pounded down. A man drenched, wearing a long black trench coat that clung to his body. He didn't have an umbrella, didn't even seem to care about the storm raging around him. Just standing there. I glanced around the bus. The older couple up front exchanged worried looks. The man in the suit shifted in his sleep, and the woman in the back continued to stare out the window, oblivious. But I could feel it, the unease creeping through the air, tightening like a noose. The driver hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the controls, and then with a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the door. I held my breath as the man stepped onto the bus, his footsteps heavy and wet against the floor. He walked down the aisle with measured steps, water dripping from his coat and pooling beneath his feet. I couldn't see his face clearly, just a glimpse of pale skin beneath the shadow of his collar. But something about him felt wrong. Like he didn't belong here, like he shouldn't be here. My stomach tightened as he passed by, the smell of dampness and something else, something metallic, lingering in the air. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at anyone. Just kept walking until he reached the seat directly behind me. And then he sat down. I could feel his presence immediately, the air around me thickening, making it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. His eyes were on me. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew. I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing into the back of my neck, cold and heavy. My hands clenched into fists in my lap, and I forced myself to look straight ahead, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was, the tension inside the bus was suffocating, and with every second that passed, I felt more and more like I was trapped. And whatever that man was, whatever he wanted, I had a feeling I wasn't going to like it. The bus jolted back into motion, but the mood inside had shifted. I could feel it, thick and oppressive, like the air before a storm. The older couple up front was whispering to each other now, their heads close, their voices too low for me to hear, but there was no mistaking the tension in their movements. The man in the suit stirred in his seat, no longer sleeping as peacefully as before. He rubbed his eyes, fidgeting, as if the same discomfort gnawing at me had finally reached him. The woman in the back, she hadn't moved, but something about the way she stared out the window, her hands clutching the armrests a little too tight, told me she felt it too. I didn't dare turn around, but I didn't have to. I could feel him, the man behind me. His presence was like a shadow creeping over me, cold and suffocating. Every few minutes, I would hear it, his breathing. Slow, deliberate, and too close for comfort. The sound seemed to fill my ears, louder than the rain, louder than the engine of the bus. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but something strange was happening. The landscape outside was changing, or at least, it felt like it was. The bus had turned off the main highway and onto a narrow, winding road, one I didn't recognize. There were no signs, no landmarks, just a stretch of empty asphalt cutting through the darkness. The rain had gotten heavier, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up, but even through the downpour, I could see that something wasn't right. The trees looked twisted, misshapen in the flashes of lightning. The road seemed to stretch on forever, as if we were driving in circles, going nowhere. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to shake off the dizziness creeping over me. Was I imagining it? Was it just exhaustion? But when I opened my eyes again, things only seemed worse. The edges of my vision were blurred, like I was looking at the world through frosted glass, and the bus. It felt like it was moving slower. Too slow. Almost like we weren't moving at all. And then I heard it. A whisper. You feel it, don't you? The voice was low, raspy, like sandpaper scraping against stone. It was right behind me, so close I could almost feel his breath on my neck. My heart slammed against my chest as I froze, gripping the edge of the seat so hard my knuckles turned white. Something brought me here. The voice continued, quiet but insistent, like it was meant just for me. And now we're all together. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My throat felt tight, and the words he spoke crawled under my skin, like they were burrowing deep into my mind. I wanted to scream, to turn around and confront him, but I was too scared. Something told me that if I looked back, if I saw his face, there would be no turning back. The bus took another sharp turn, the wheels skidding slightly on the slick road. The driver's eyes flickered up to the rearview mirror again, his expression blank, almost detached. But I saw it, just for a second, a twitch in his jaw, like he knew. Like he could feel the same darkness creeping in. Everything felt wrong. The road, the bus, the people. It was like the world was slipping away, dissolving into something I couldn't understand. And whatever was happening, I had the sinking feeling that there was no way out. The atmosphere in the bus had become unbearable. Every second that passed, the sense of wrongness clawed at me, growing heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside was shifting, bending, but it wasn't just the road anymore. Time itself felt off, like minutes were stretching into hours, like we were caught in some endless loop on this deserted, rain-soaked road. I glanced up to check on the other passengers, searching for something familiar to cling to. The couple up front. They were gone. My heart skipped a beat. Just moments ago, they had been sitting there, whispering nervously to each other. Now, their seats were completely empty. No sign of them, no trace that they had ever been there. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around the bus. The man in the suit? Gone. His seat was empty, his briefcase sitting untouched beside it. Panic surged through me. I knew what I had seen. They had been here. They couldn't just vanish. I turned my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The woman in the back, the one who had been staring out the window the entire trip, her seat was empty too. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. It was like the bus was swallowing them, one by one, erasing them from existence. It was just me now. Me and the man sitting behind me. And the driver. The heavy breathing behind me had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I could feel my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the seat, trying to steady myself. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever was coming next. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, or at least try to stop it. I stood up, my legs shaky, and forced myself to walk toward the front of the bus. The aisle felt longer than it should have, stretching out as if the distance was growing with each step I took. When I finally reached the driver, he didn't turn to look at me. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tight. Where are they? My voice came out in a hoarse whisper, but it was all I could manage. The passengers, where did they go? No answer. Stop the bus. I demanded, louder this time, my voice trembling with fear. Stop it now. Slowly, ever so slowly, the driver turned his head toward me. I stepped back instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. His face. There was something terribly wrong with his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over his bones, and his eyes were hollow, completely black, as if the life had been drained out of him. "They've already arrived," he said, his voice low and twisted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him. "And soon, so will you." A cold shiver ran through me, my body frozen in place as his words sank in. Arrived where? What was he talking about? I glanced out the window, but the world outside was no longer recognizable. The road, the trees, the rain, everything blurred together into a swirling black void, as if we were no longer in any place I could understand. My head spun, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still awake or trapped in some horrible dream. I turned to the door, my hand reaching for the emergency handle, but the driver's voice stopped me. "There's no escape," he said, his smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged, like something out of a nightmare. "You're already here." The bus groaned as it slowed down, but I had no idea where we were or if we were even anywhere at all. My heart raced as the doors hissed open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond them. I backed away, my body trembling, as the driver's voice echoed in my ears. "Time to get off," he said, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Your stop is here." I stood frozen, staring into the black void beyond the open bus doors. The storm outside had become a distant murmur, as if the world itself had faded away, leaving me suspended in this eerie, unnatural silence. My heart pounded so hard in my chest I could feel it in my throat, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't step forward, couldn't make myself get off this bus. I didn't even know if there was ground out there, or if I'd just fall into nothing. The driver's words echoed in my head, looping endlessly. "They've already arrived." But arrived where? Where had they gone? The older couple, the man in the suit, the woman in the back. Had they stepped off into this same darkness? Had they vanished the moment they crossed the threshold? Or were they still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of anything I could comprehend? I didn't want to find out. I couldn't. But I was the last one, and I had no choice. Behind me, I felt the presence of the man in the trench coat again, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, just as it had from the moment he stepped on the bus. The air seemed to thicken with every second that passed, cold and suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. His breathing was soft now, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I knew he was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. The driver's voice broke the silence, low and mocking. "You don't want to miss your stop, Amanda." My name on his lips sent a fresh wave of terror through me. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken to him, hadn't said a word this entire ride. But he knew. He knew everything. I took a step back, retreating from the open door, and turned to face him. His hollow, black eyes glinted in the dim light, a twisted smile creeping across his gaunt face. "This is the end of the line," he said, almost gleeful. "No turning back now." The man behind me shifted in his seat, and I could feel the cold radiating from him, seeping into my bones. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The road outside was gone, the storm swallowed by this endless darkness. And here, inside this bus, time felt meaningless. "Where are they?" I demanded, my voice breaking with fear. "What did you do to them?" The driver chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "They've arrived. At the destination they were always meant for. And now it's your turn." I backed away further, my hand gripping the edge of a seat for balance as the walls of the bus seemed to pulse around me. The seats, once occupied, were now nothing more than shadows, empty shells of the people who had disappeared. The air hummed with something unnatural, like a low vibration just beyond hearing, and it made my head spin. I had to get out. I had to escape, but how? The door was still open, but stepping into that void felt like surrendering to something far worse than death. The driver's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "There's no escape, Amanda. You've been on this ride for a long time. You just didn't know it." I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, a mix of panic and despair. There was no way out. The bus wasn't going to stop, not really. It would just keep going, taking me deeper into whatever nightmare this was. I turned toward the window, but all I saw was darkness pressing against the glass, like it was alive, waiting to consume me. The bus rumbled beneath my feet, the engine groaning like it was coming apart. The world outside was gone. I was already too far. The driver leaned back in his seat, satisfied. "This is your stop. It's time to go." The man behind me stood up, and I felt his presence closing in, his cold breath on the back of my neck. My whole body froze in terror. I couldn't move. I couldn't fight. And the truth hit me like a tidal wave. I was never going to leave this bus. The doors hissed shut, sealing me in. The last thing I heard was the sound of the engine roaring to life, the bus plunging into the dark, taking me with it. And then, everything went black. It was one of those nights where the sky seemed ready to collapse. The rain pounded against the windows in a relentless rhythm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone. My wife had taken the kids to visit her parents, leaving me with a rare moment of quiet. No noise, no demands, just me and an old movie playing on the TV. I settled into the couch, trying to enjoy the calm, the kind of peace that, as a father, you don't get often. But something about the night felt heavy. The rain wasn't just background noise, it was overwhelming. Every drop against the glass, every gust of wind felt louder than it should. It wasn't just the sound, it was how everything seemed darker. The living room, usually a place of comfort, now felt like a shadowy, isolated corner of the world. I tried to brush off the feeling. It's just a storm, I told myself. But with every passing minute, the sense of isolation grew. The storm was wrapping itself around the house, like it was trying to swallow it whole, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on the movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I was halfway through the movie when I heard it, a faint knock at the door. At first, I thought it was just part of the storm, maybe something blown by the wind, but it was too deliberate. A soft, rhythmic tapping, barely audible over the rain. I paused the movie, straining to listen. There it was again, like someone gently knocking, hesitant but persistent. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was almost 11 at night. Who would be out in a storm like this? I stood up, my heart already beating a little faster than it should. Probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe a branch or the wind playing tricks. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty street, lit dimly by the yellow glow of the street lamps. The rain fell in sheets, drenching everything, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I waited for a moment listening, but all I could hear was the rain pounding on the roof and the occasional gust of wind. I shook my head, feeling a little foolish, and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to relax, the knock came again. This time, louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine. I muted the TV, staring at the door. Something was off. It wasn't just the knocking, it was the way it cut through the storm, like it was meant only for me. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was outside, and it wanted my attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so against my better judgment, I walked back to the door and opened it. Cold air and rain immediately hit me, making me shiver, but there was still no one there. The street was just as empty as before, the storm raging on as if it were oblivious to the unease building inside me. I was about to close the door when something caught my eye. Mud. There were muddy footprints on the floor just inside the doorway. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't noticed them before, and they definitely hadn't been there when I last checked. The prints were fresh, still wet, leading from the entrance and disappearing up the stairs. My stomach dropped. I closed the door behind me, locking it this time, and slowly followed the trail, each step feeling heavier than the last. My mind raced. Someone had been inside, but how? I hadn't heard the door open, and I hadn't seen anyone outside. The footprints led me straight to the stairs, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening with each step I took. As I reached the top of the stairs, I realized where the tracks were leading, the children's bedroom. My hands were shaking as I turned the knob, opening the door slowly. The room was still, untouched, except for one thing. The doll. My daughter's doll, the one that usually sat on her shelf, was now in the middle of the room. Its small porcelain face stared straight at me, its lifeless eyes glinting in the dim light. But it wasn't just the fact that the doll had moved. I knew, it hadn't been there before. The room had been perfectly tidy when I last checked. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to make sense of it. The rain pounded against the window, the house eerily quiet now except for the storm. And yet, in that stillness, I felt like I wasn't alone. I stood there, staring at the doll, my mind trying to make sense of how it had moved on its own. The room was cold, too cold, as if the storm outside had somehow seeped in. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but my legs felt glued to the spot. Then I heard it. A low, raspy sound echoed from the hallway, like someone struggling to breathe. My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears, and there, at the far end of the corridor, was a figure. A dark, shadowy outline just standing there, motionless, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was too tall to be my wife or one of my kids. It was just wrong. My body tensed as adrenaline surged through me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter. Then, as if the house itself was reacting, the lights flickered. For a brief second, everything went black, and when they flickered back on, the figure was gone. Just vanished. Panic surged through me like a wave. My heart raced, and my chest tightened with fear. I couldn't stay in this house. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it definitely wasn't something I wanted to stick around and confront. Without another thought, I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, my footsteps pounding louder than the rain. I needed to leave, to get out of this place before whatever it was decided to show itself again. I sprinted down the stairs, my heart in my throat, desperate to get out of the house. The storm outside felt safer than whatever was inside with me. I reached the front door, barely able to breathe, and yanked it open, my hands trembling uncontrollably. But the moment the door swung wide, I froze. There, standing in the rain, was a hooded figure. It was motionless, drenched by the downpour, the rain running off the black fabric of its cloak in steady streams. My breath caught in my chest as the figure slowly lifted its head. Underneath the hood, a pale, twisted face emerged, deformed, unnatural, and grinning at me with a smile that radiated pure malice. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the terror gripping me. My legs refused to move, rooted to the ground as I stared into those hollow, soulless eyes. Then, before I could even process what was happening, the door slammed shut in front of me, as if the house itself had decided I wasn't going anywhere. The sound echoed through the hallway, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. No more knocks, no more strange sounds, just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating, as if the house had swallowed all the noise. I looked down at the floor and watched as the muddy footprints I had followed upstairs slowly faded, disappearing as if they were never there to begin with. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing made sense anymore. Whatever had been in this house, whatever had come to visit me during the storm, it was gone now, leaving me alone with questions I didn't want to answer. And remember, not all stories end when the video does. Sleep well if you can.